On that last day, you know there's only room for blank stacks and stacks of staves, waiting to find their melodies, waiting to take your place. But on that last day, they'll be devastated just like you. What I just read was an excerpt from the first poem that I willingly wrote. I'll be honest, it's a messy piece of bad verse about leaving a summer camp. I still couldn't bring myself to tell anyone how nostalgic I felt, even a few weeks after leaving camp. And no matter how badly I wanted to call up my friends from camp and talk about all the amazing and memorable moments we shared, I didn't. If I did, I would have had to face the reality of my situation over and over again. So I tried my best to avoid it altogether and admit to myself that I would never return to the community I held closest to my heart. But when I listened to Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin, a traditional camp song, all my memories of camp came rushing back to me. But instead of pushing these memories out of my head, I savored them and wrote my first poem about camp. Looking back, I have to admit that this first poem wasn't the best thing I've ever written. Some part of me knew I could make something out of poetry. After all, it gradually evolved from a simple hobby to my positive outlet. Instead of having to express my thoughts out loud or keep them entirely to myself, I could simply write them down in stanzas. Whether you read it or write it, love it or hate it, I want you to know that poetry is much more than a few words simply put together to sound meaningful. So today, let's first learn about the ways we can use poetry to reflect on our lives. Next, we'll see the ways poetry can help us gain the courage we need to overcome adversity. And finally, we'll find out how we can move forward with our lives, starting with one word, one line, and one poem. Poetry can be a positive outlet for reflection because of its relationship with music and memories. Shortly after I wrote that first poem, I created a playlist of all the songs I heard during my time at camp. I did this because I realized that I could listen to songs that reminded me of specific moments in my life and write poems to preserve the memories I associated with those songs. Research published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies found that areas of the brain associated with memory were activated when reading a favorite poem. According to Adam Zeman, a professor at the University of Exeter, the common denominator between music and poetry is that they both evoke emotional landscapes and let us experience emotions outside of their normal setting. These emotional experiences, which he called shivers down the spine, are unique to poetry and indicate recollection and introspection. Poetry can send shivers down our spine, and it can also help people overcome adversity, in part because poetry has so many health benefits. Let's consult Dr. Robin Phillip, a consultant at the Bristol Royal Infirmary in the UK, who often uses poetry with his patients. His research suggests that poetry can combat depression. 75% of participants in one of his studies found poetry to provide an emotional release. For others, writing poetry helped them to completely wean themselves off of antidepressants and other forms of medication. So, why don't therapists dump the pills and take up poetry? With confusing social situations and pressure from school and work, most of us have a lot to process while trying to maintain balanced lives. It's not easy for all of us to talk about all of our problems, but we can write poetry as a personal way to reflect on our lives without having to worry about external sources of criticism and judgment. Nikki Jakowska, author of Write for Life, supports this idea. She states, "Sometimes our thoughts get caught up in a mental loop. By writing them down, we are getting them out there. You might think or say, 'I feel unhappy,' but that's only as far as it goes. With writing poetry, you can go even further. You begin to use metaphors and examples to arrive at a very specific definition of your own particular unhappiness. Ultimately, this self-awareness enables us to tackle problems and move on." So far, you've learned about how poetry can help us to reflect and overcome adversity. I I could continue to give you even more statistics and quotes about poetry and its benefits, but I do believe it's very important to understand the impact of poetry on a personal level. Not long after I left camp, I was a sophomore, and I dealt with problems that I felt were too personal to share with even my family or my closest friends. I felt as if my goals and opinions were constantly being invalidated, and at the same time, I was nostalgic for summer camp and other places I thought I'd never see again. And this is where I unknowingly began to use poetry as a positive outlet for myself to move forward. In my poems, I wrote about my feelings of nostalgia and frustration, as well as how much I wished to return to the past and savor happier moments of my life. And this is where the relationship between poetry, music, and memories comes into play. I've made a playlist of songs for each month of every year for the past 3 years. And the songs I've collected in every single one of these playlists have been the main inspiration for most of my poetry. Whenever I wanted to bring back a memory of a certain person, place, or event, I would simply search for a playlist, pick a song, and write about whatever came to mind. When I realized that I had way too many poems to keep track of, I decided to publish my first poetry collection, titled Return. I may be an extreme case in having to write a book of poetry to cure my own homesickness, but the fact still stands that poetry has saved my life. I directly confronted my problems because I wrote about them honestly. More importantly, I realized that there will always be a new chapter of my life, and that I have so much to look forward to. Now that you know why poetry has so many benefits, it's your turn to experience the magic of poetry for yourself. Sometime after this speech, get out a pen and a piece of paper. Write a poem about anything you want. If absolutely nothing comes out, that's okay. So here are 3 things I highly suggest to keep in mind when beginning to write poetry. First of all, the first poem that you willingly write is the most important. It is your first attempt and will not be perfect. Nobody is born a poet because anyone can learn how to write poetry. Many things take effort, time, and practice, and writing poetry is one of them. Secondly, don't search for inspiration because it will find you. My worst poems, the ones I always cringe at, are, not surprisingly, the ones I force myself to write. Nobody can tell you what you should write about because you're the only one who knows what you feel. Finally, you will know when you are a poet, and more importantly, you will know when you have moved forward when you ask yourself one question. What would I be like without poetry? Without poetry, I would not be here. I would still be stuck in the past, somewhere in my sophomore year. I would not be here. Whenever I sit down to write a new poem, I think back to a few lines of one of my favorite poems that I've ever written. It's titled Why I Write, and here's an excerpt from it. I write to prove, not myself, but the truth, that nobody is born a poet. I was not born a poet, nor was I raised to become one. And to prove that nothing else matters, nothing else should. The moment we give the paper a little ink, we give away a part of ourselves that simply continues to expand and transform into something too powerful, too alive, too impossible to ignore. And this is why I believe that moving forward can begin with one word, one line, and one poem. Thank you very much.